Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast. The 18-minute Battle of San Jacinto proved to be a decisive victory for Texas, ensuring its independence and the establishment of a republic. But in its wake, some unfinished business remained. What to do with a prisoner of war who happened to be the opponent's president and general. Today, we reveal the events that unfolded 189 years ago this week when Santa Anna became a prisoner of war, his attempts to stay alive and escape during his 7 months as San Jacinto's infamous prisoner. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. Today, we are joined by independent historian and author James Bevill and Dr. Bruce Winders, the Alamo's former curator. Thank you both for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
My pleasure.
James, and you go by Jim, let's start by introducing you to our audience, because it was actually Dr. Winders here who encouraged you down the road of becoming an author.
Yeah, that goes back a while. We were looking at doing an exhibit of Texas money in the Alamo, and this was, 18, 19 years ago. And we were having lunch at the Meager Hotel, and Bruce says, Jim, you ought to take your notes and maybe turn that into a book on the subject. I don't think anything's ever been done. And that's what initially started the idea for the paper Republic.
And Dr. Winders, you wrote the foreword for that book.
Yes, I did. The work that Jim had done, it was really kind of groundbreaking in the idea that so much really existed to be interpreted as history rather than just, these are all banknotes, these are all things. What he was able to do is to provide the context of letting them tell the story of Texas history.
So, Jim, you went from writing about money in the Republic of Texas period to now the 8 months Santa Anna spent incarcerated in Texas. What made you want to shine a brighter light on that topic?
When I first came across that in the story after San Jacinto, I did not know what had happened to Santa Anna. And as I'm trying to introduce the character into the story, there was a book in 1932. It was called Santa Anna, the Napoleon of the West. And I was going through the book, and it had this fascinating account of when he was torn off the ship at Velasco, off the schooner Invincible, how they, he was on opium, and just all kind of crazy stuff I had never seen before. But you have to have those individual stories. You have to have those anecdotes on these people to make the rest of the book flow, because it wasn't just a story about money or currency or Texas. It was about the people that made all that happen. Santa Anna was obviously one of the central figures of the Texas Revolution struggle.
Dr. Winders, remind us, how was Santa Anna captured after the Mexican defeat at San Jacinto in April 1836?
Well, he's captured not the day of the battle, but on the 22nd of April. And he had evidently ridden away from the battle and tried to secret himself. He's dressed as a civilian or a private, depending on whose account you're looking at. Parties had been sent out to look for him and other Mexican officers that were missing, and they just happened to encounter him and were able to take him back to Sam Houston. And the ironic or the odd thing is they didn't know who they had, because he didn't introduce himself as I'm El Presidente. But when he got back to camp, captured Mexican soldiers began shouting his name and Viva Santa Anna and El Presidente. And so the Texans knew who he had. And the fact that he was captured the second day probably saved his life, because had he been captured the first day or taken the first day, the bloodlust of the Texans was so great that nobody could have probably prevented that.
So Santa Anna and Sam Houston are now face to face. Jim, what is that conversation like?
Stressful. I mean, it was stressful because they brought him. Houston at first was polite and was cordial, and then he accosted Santa Anna for the massacres of the men at the Alamo and at Goliad. And when he did, Santa Anna was visibly shaking. And you got to realize he's standing under a tree in a camp as a prisoner surrounded by the enemy. Now, Houston had the foresight to bring Lorenzo de Zavala forward to identify him, which he did, and Santa Anna was visibly shaken and about to have a nervous breakdown because there were calls to throw a rope over a tree, and Houston had offered him an opium, which is the only available painkiller. And he'd been chewing the opium to relieve the excruciating pain from the musket ball, which had shattered his ankle and hit his leg. And Santa Anna obviously did. He accepted that. And then over time, maybe it was an hour, maybe it was 2 hours, they agreed to an armistice, which is effectively a ceasefire and an agreement for Santa Anna to withdraw the armies away from the area, down to Bahar and to Victoria. And so the fate of Texas had finally been decided first on the battlefield, and then by these two commanders, each of which were a little bit stoned on opium as they signed an armistice to cease hostilities.
And it's important to point out Santa Anna is essentially a prisoner of war at this point. The opponent's president in general being a POW just feels like different stakes here.
Well, it's much like the end of World War II, the capture of the Nazi leadership.
They move forward with the Treaty of Velasco, which is signed a few weeks later on May 14th. So there's a public treaty and a private treaty. What does each one state? And we'll start with the public treaty.
Well, the public treaty of Velasco ceased hostilities, and it stipulated that Santa Anna would order his forces to withdraw below the Rio Grande and not take up arms against Texas. Now, it's important to point out that the other two armies in Texas, under Generals Filosola and Urrea, were largely already withdrawn. So he just reinforced them to keep going. That was the main effect there. The secret treaty was a little bit different because under the secret treaty, and it was secret because it was politically unpopular. Texas was to transport Santa Anna to the Mexican coastal city of Veracruz. So he was a prisoner of war. They were going to return him, and they thought because his term as president of the Mexican Republic would not end until the fall, they wanted to do so while he was still in a position of influence. And they had two commissioners, Bailey Hardiman and Lorenzo de Zavallo, were planning to accompany him down there. So they were going to try to get a more permanent treaty established.
And in exchange, Santa Anna was supposed to do something. What was that?
They hoped that he would use his influence to have the Mexican government receive Texas commissioners so they could work out a permanent solution between Mexico and Texas.
To acknowledge Texas independence.
Yes.
But there's a long-standing rule that a government could not be bound by a treaty made by a prisoner. So how does that impact the validity of these agreements?
Well, in the short term, the troop withdrawals took place. So that was the most immediate effect of the Treaty of Velasco, is that Urrea and Filosola continued to withdraw out of the area. Now, they said both sides, they were going to also replace, damaged property. That never happened. Both sides would exchange prisoners. That did happen. So the withdrawal of the troops was a good thing. The release and the exchange of prisoners was also a good thing. So in the very short term it had, but the de facto government in Mexico, like Bruce pointed out, refused to honor anything that Santa Anna signed while he was a prisoner of war.
And Santa Anna initially doesn't want to sign this, but he also doesn't want to be executed. He's got a survivor's instinct.
Yeah, he did not want to fix his signature to that document. He said, my word of good faith and my honor and so forth. And they were calls to take him outside and shoot him, and he caved in and signed it. Sure.
The idea of releasing Santa Anna, though, as agreed to in that secret treaty, it just does not score any political points in Texas. What's the reaction?
Well, the ruffian element in Texas just wanted to hang him. They weren't going to let him go. They were just completely up in arms about it.
The effect of the Goliad massacre and what had happened at the Alamo, it's hard for us to, as modern people, we remember the Alamo. We say that, but they don't have to remember it because it's so fresh. It's a fresh wound. And so the idea of having the person that they blame for all this disaster that's befallen them, to have him as a prisoner and not to have retribution is just untenable thought. Now, one of the great, I kind of hesitate using the word myths when I talk about Texas history because it's such an easy throwaway, but there's this idea that Santa Anna's life was saved because he was a Mason. And so when he comes into camp, he encounters Houston, who is also a Mason, and Santa Anna gives the international distress signal, and Houston recognizes him as a Mason and spares his life. What that doesn't take into consideration is that Santa Anna had ordered the execution of fellow Masons, and that there were many Masons in the Texan camp that still wanted him dead, even though it had been, a murder against or the death of a brother Mason. So that persists in some circles, but it's not actually what happened.
Jim, your research shows it was hard to even find a ship commander that was willing to bring Santa Ana back to Mexico.
There were only two of them down there. When Burnett finally makes an order to go ahead and return him by ship, he went to Charles Hawkins, the captain of the Independence, and he said, quote, "I would sooner blow up my ship and my crew." They threatened him with a court-martial. Of course, that never happened. It would have been way too politically unpopular to court-martial him, but that was assigned to Captain Jeremiah Brown of the Invincible, whose ship was anchored outside of Velasco. And that's where Santa Ana was taken as they were preparing to depart the Gulf of Mexico to take him back to Mexico.
So Santa Ana boards this ship to go home, but there are some people on the next ship over. They get wind of this. They're not happy, and they take action.
That's right. And then when they found out that the butcher of the Alamo was on the ship, anchored basically right next to them, or maybe it was, 100 yards, it was very close. They just boarded a longboat, and the commander, Thomas Jefferson Greene, gets in the boat. They row over the Invincible. They climb on board. They declare themselves, and the crew's like, "Oh, yeah, you want to talk to him? He's right down here." So they found him in a cabin. He had taken some opium, and he was like raving like a madman. He was crying like a child. He was hysterical when he heard that he might be removed from that ship. It was an ugly scene.
The crew tried to take him ashore in leg irons. What happened after that?
Well, obviously, if he was in leg irons, he wasn't going to try to swim to safety. And so when he was finally removed from the ship, because Burnett had revoked the embarkation order, they had him in a rowboat. And there were two accounts of this. And one saw the Mexican president, they said he was forced to wave a Texas flag over his head. And then Herman Ehrenberg, who was a Goliad survivor, witnessed it from the shore. And he said that he was just had his head down and he was looking at the bottom of the boat. He didn't want to make eye contact with anybody. And he had a Texas flag, flying over his head. So depending upon where you were standing as you're watching this, it probably did look like he was waving the flag over his head. And as they got a little closer, the account was a little bit different. But there was definitely a Texas flag over Santa Ana's head as he was being brought into the harbor. And then they put him in confinement in Quintana before he went into Velasco.
The historical record also shows that before Santa Ana left the ship, he wrote a letter to the interim president of Texas. What did he say in that letter?
Well, he said that he would rather be shot on board by the Marines. And I actually doubted it until I looked and found it in the papers of the Texas Revolution. And sure enough, he did not want to be besieged and, torn apart by a mob. And the strange thing is, Lorenzo de Zavala, the Texas vice president, helped him compose the letter. And I found it interesting that he probably just said, just tell him you'd rather be shot on board by the Marines. They're not going to do that. Just don't worry about it, But it was his attempt at having honor and refusing to surrender and so forth.
Before we go forward with Santa Ana's journey as a prisoner of war, I want to stop and talk about opium. We've mentioned it a couple of times. At the time, was it more common? Was it kind of the only painkiller around? Just looking for some perspective on that.
It was commonly had, and it was known as a sedative. I have references from my Mexican War research where soldiers are talking about they're having an upset stomach, so they'll take a bit of opium. But it was not considered as the recreational drug that we look at it today. It was actually seen as an actual medicine.
Well, from there, Santa Ana and other prisoners are moved to a few different locations. In one place, Santa Ana makes some demands that a colonel go out and make some big purchases on his behalf. What were those, Jim?
That's an interesting little side story about this. There was a colonel named Juan Holzinger, and Holzinger had served in the Mexican army under Urrea. He knew Santa Ana from way back in the chain of military command or whatever, and they actually had a chance meeting. Holzinger is a prisoner at this point. After San Jacinto, he was a prisoner, and they were in Burnett's office. And when he was in Burnett's office doing the deposition, Santa Ana was escorted in. They had this rapid conversation in Spanish. They hadn't seen each other in years and so forth. So a few days later, after Santa Ana is taken back to Velasco, Holzinger apparently has another meeting with him. And he and Herman Ehrenberg, who is a Goliad survivor, are on the way to New Orleans. One was in the Texas Army, One was in the Mexican army. Both of them are German, or Prussians, as they called them back then. They both speak Germans, and they became an unlikely set of friends. And Ehrenberg wrote that Holzinger told him, quote, the Mexican consul was ordered to buy, among other things, this is by Santa Anna, a silver coffee service with all the accoutrements needed to set an elegant table, various delicacies. The consul was also instructed to buy Santa Anna a Negro cook, because the simplified lifestyles and the culinary skills of the Texans did not appeal to the palate of El Presidente when he was in captivity. So he knew he was going to be gone a long time. By the way, you're going to New Orleans, order this for me from the consul. But the consul refused to advance the disgraced president a single dollar worth of goods, much less buy him a cook. So when Holzinger and Ehrenberg broke up in New Orleans, he said he was never able to get anything accomplished out of that.
Our conversation continues after this message.
Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide Stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Welcome back to the Alamo podcast. In the heat of summer in 1836, Texas keeps moving Santa Anna and his fellow prisoners first to a plantation along the Brazos and then to a farm. What's the wisdom in keeping them on the move?
Keep him safe so the Texans wouldn't kill him. You know, they were worried about a lynch mob. And also there was a man rode up on a horse to William Patton's plantation and fired a revolver through the window. Miss Nunez and Miss Almonte, Santa Anna apparently wasn't in the room, but they had to get him out of there. It was just too much hostility on the local level.
So Texas may have refused to go buy him, the silver service that you're talking about. But he was treated pretty well. He got to pass time by playing games like dominoes.
Right.
Meantime, there's a plot being hatched involving a Spanish wine merchant to help Santa Anna and his fellow prisoners escape. How does this unfold?
It's an interesting question, and this is the part that's not real well known. While the four prisoners were in Velasco, and there were four of them, there Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Juan Martinez Caro, which is his chief of staff, and Colonels Juan Almonte and Gabriel Nunez. So you had these four Mexican prisoners, and they were being held upstairs in a restaurant in Velasco. It was a two-story building. And this guy, his name was Bartolome Pages. He was a Spanish wine merchant. He's introduced to them, and he starts talking to these four prisoners because they're upstairs. He speaks Spanish. He's friendly. He's neutral. He wasn't a Mexican officer. They strike up these conversations. And so it was Caro, the secretary, Ramon Martinez Caro. He tells him, look, Pages, why don't you go to New Orleans, pay a visit to the Mexican consulate, and tell them that you're on a special mission for Santa Anna. See if you can borrow money through the Mexican consul, use it to purchase a ship carrying a cargo for cover, and then you can sail the ship along with its haul back here to Texas. And then if we can get out to the ship, we can sail away. But if it gets discovered, you can just say it was a big ruse, you can expose the plot, and then we'll be heroes, and then we'll still be freed anyway. So that's how that started out. The strange thing was after Pages went to New Orleans to start, and he did decide to do that mission and talk to the consulate, after he left, the prisoners were moved. And that's when they were moved up deeper into Brazoria County, what is now Brazoria County. And he really had no idea that they had been moved. So the Mexican captives really didn't know what happened to him after that. When Pages went to New Orleans, he did meet with the consulate. He told them what they wanted to accomplish. So over time, and what he found out was the Mexican consul was much more accommodating. So according to Pages, the consulate arranged for the Lizardi brothers, who was a merchants in New Orleans that had close ties to Mexico. He said, they're going to loan you $4,500, which you can purchase the Passaic. It was a transport vessel with a single gun. So it was a small ship with a single gun, already had a crew, already had a hired crew, had a cargo valued about $2,000. So we don't know what the cargo was. None of the accounts say what it was, but it was something. Might have been cotton, might have been something else. So Pages buys this ship with borrowed Mexican money, and he brings the ship back to Velasco. And when he comes there, he also brought two other items to New Orleans, each of which got him into trouble. The first was a bottle of opium and some opium-laced wine. The opium was bought through an intermediary, as was the ship in order to cover his tracks. So his plan was to pay a visit to Santa Ana, then knock out the guards by plying them with wine or booze laced with the drugs. The other thing that he got from the Mexican consul was a letter of transit advising any Mexican vessel that might stop him and the ship to let them through the ports unmolested. The letter stated that any warship or corsair that might visit the ship should protect him and assisting. It was vague about providing great service to the Mexican nation. So that's how that trip to New Orleans went. And so Pages comes back to Velasco in the ship, and nobody really knows he's there at that point in time.
And what happens next?
They had some visitors in Velasco, and this is like August of 1836. And it was almost like they had an open house because Santa Anna, even in captivity, he was famous. He was really, really famous. And the locals were thrilled to meet him. So the English-speaking Almonte sits down with the ladies and converses them with English. And this is in the James Phelps house in Brazoria, which is known as the Orozimbo Plantation. And they've got all these visitors there. And then Caro looks up and he noticed that Pages, the wine merchant, is amongst the visitors. Now, they hadn't seen him in a couple of months, and he just shows up, and he's in here, and he maneuvers a way to sit next to him. And he sits next to him, and he turns to him in Spanish, because they were prohibited from speaking anything other than English. And he asks him, what's going on? And Pages says, I was unable to do anything. They took away the crew I'd secured for the schooner, and I bought the ship in New Orleans, but y'all are really a considerable distance from the seashore now. So we'll have to find another way to get El Presidente out there by boat. And then things went rapidly downhill after that conversation. There was a Texian sergeant who overheard the suspicious whispering and took the Spaniard aside and began the account said, abusing him with 1,000 epithets and scolding Caro for disregarding the orders. And Caro claimed his innocence and tried to calm the sergeant down by telling him he was only trying to order supplies for Pages. But what happened was when Major Patton, in charge of the Texan Guards, returned to Orozimbo the next day, he questioned Pages about the conversation, and his investigations aroused enough suspicion. They sent a crew out and they searched the ship papers. That revealed the letter from the Mexican consul, the passport. So Patton then tells Caro that the Texans had received a tip in New Orleans that something was up, and that aroused their suspicions when they saw that ship arrive in Velasco. And it was also discovered that Pages had recruited a local Mexican boy to secure a small boat for him, and that small boat was used to take the prisoners down the Brazos River out to the Passaic.
So the jig is up. The Texans know Santa Ana and Almonte have been trying to escape, and they lose some of the privileges that they had been enjoying. Instead of getting to play games like dominoes, they are shackled with a ball and chain for 52 days and spend some of that time chained to an oak tree. That's true. Now, at this point, too, Pages was, after that deposition, he's in jail. So Pages, the wine merchant, he's in jail. Caro, ironically, is released for turning state's evidence against Santa Ana. He exposes the whole thing, and then he gets free. So Caro's out of the picture. He's on a boat back to New Orleans. But that's how the plot got exposed.
One of the things I might mention is the idea of a jail. This is Texas in its infancy, and so things that we think of jails and prisons don't exist. And so that's why prisoners were kept in private houses or in restaurants or, in fact, chained to trees, because what other options did you have? That's a little context for why those things are happening back then. And Jim, your research uncovered a suicide attempt. Tell us about that.
Santa Ana was very depressed. If you can imagine being shackled in a ball and chain outside in Brazoria County for 52 days in August and September, you would be depressed too. It was a mosquito-ridden plantation, and he was so despondent. Many of us have read accounts that Santa Ana took some poison, and Dr. Phelps had pumped it from his stomach to save his life, and it was a suicide. I don't know that it was a suicide because it wasn't poison. It was the wine that was laced with the opium. Pages had actually gotten those inside the Phelps house. That's how close they came to get him in. When those people were gone, they were probably going to offer a round of drinks to knock out the guards. Well, Santa Anna drank the wine that was prepared for his guards. And while it wasn't poison, if you died from an overdose, it had exactly the same effect. But he survived.
I think one of the reasons this is an important story is because in traditional Texas history, Santa Anna's story pretty much ends with his capture. And Texas is independent and everything's good and happy after that. That's not what happens.
History's not that clean. It's messy.
And Santa Anna goes on to have much more impact in Texas history, in Mexican history, in U.S. history. So this is just part of the interesting chapters in his multifaceted life.
Sam Houston is sworn in as Texas's first official president in October 1836, and he's getting pressure from U.S. President Andrew Jackson, his old militia commander, to release Santa Anna.
Yeah, well, Santa Anna travels by horseback. He releases him with a crew of diplomats to go to Washington, D.C. He's going to release him to President Jackson, through the embassy. I mean, they rode across San Jacinto. They rode up through northern Louisiana. They went up the Mississippi River. They got a steamboat up the Ohio River.
Texans can't be happy about this.
No, but they were already out of Texas by the time most of the people found out about this. It was Almonte and Santa Anna went out because Colonel Nunez was released at that point in time to go to New Orleans. They arrived in Louisville, Kentucky on Christmas Day, and the news of his arrival preceded him. And when he arrived in Washington in January of 1837, Santa Anna was hailed by the abolitionists as he passed through the city because the news of his arrival had preceded him. They did release him through diplomatic channels because Jackson was in his last few weeks as President of the United States. Vice President Martin Van Buren had recently been elected president. He was the president-elect. Van Buren met with Santa Anna and Almonte at the boarding house. And after meeting with Van Buren, the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, arrived at the boarding house. And it was he that escorted the Mexican leader to the White House to meet President Jackson.
So Santa Anna, as a prisoner of war in Texas, gets to go to the White House, meet the U.S. president, and two big things happen as a result. Shortly after, President Jackson recognizes the Republic of Texas, and Santa Anna is released and allowed to travel home to Mexico.
And they took him back on a U.S. frigate, and that was the end of his disastrous military campaign in Texas.
The 7 months Santa Anna spent in captivity in Texas, what can we take away from this time? What's the impact?
Well, I think you have to think about the alternative, the idea of what would have happened had Santa Anna been executed. We know what history plays out, how it plays out with the Treaty of Velasco and Santa Anna being treated and released. What would have happened had he been executed? We can only conjecture that things would have turned out possibly very different.
One thing that Sam Houston knew, it would have been a diplomatic disaster for the new Texas government to have executed a prisoner of war who was the head of state of another country. And Houston knew that. Burnett knew that. A lot of the ruffian elements didn't, but Bruce makes a very good point. We don't know what would have happened there, but I guess you could sum it up with what the Department of Transportation, what's their slogan? Don't mess with Texas. It applied to these guys as well.
James Bevill and Dr. Bruce Winders, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
It's my pleasure. Glad to share it with you.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to an essay Dr. Winders wrote about the capture of Santa Anna, and we've also linked to James's book, The Paper Republic. As you heard earlier, it focuses on a different aspect of Texas history. It's money. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.